The loneliness that comes after everyone thinks you're fine. There's a quiet kind of loneliness that arrives later in life, not when things fall apart, not when you're visibly struggling, but when everyone around you believes you're doing just fine. They stop checking in. They stop asking how you really are, not out of neglect, but because you've always handled things so well. You've lived long enough to know how to smile politely, to say, "I'm okay," without thinking, to carry your feelings without letting them spill. And yet, in the quiet moments, maybe in the evening, maybe when the house is still, you feel it. That soft ache of being emotionally alone while surrounded by people. If that sounds familiar, you're not weak. You're not ungrateful. You're human. And this conversation is for you. 1. When strength becomes invisibility. You've been strong for a long time. Strong in ways that didn't draw attention. Strong in ways that didn't ask for applause. You learned early on how to handle things on your own, how to keep going even when it was heavy. And over time, people came to rely on that strength. They leaned on you. They trusted you to manage. They believed you would always be okay. Sometimes, strength doesn't make life easier. It makes you easier to overlook. So gradually, the check-ins faded. The questions became shorter. The concerns softened into assumption, not because you mattered less, but because you never appeared to need help. And you didn't correct them. You didn't want to worry anyone. You didn't want to seem ungrateful. You didn't want to explain what you yourself barely had words for. So, you kept being strong. And somewhere along the way, that strength began to feel like invisibility. Not dramatic, not obvious, just a quiet sense that fewer people were really seeing you anymore. 2. Being assumed okay. There comes a moment when people stop asking how you are. Not suddenly, not unkindly. They simply assume. They assume you've settled into your life. They assume you've learned how to manage. They assume that after everything you've lived through, you don't need much attention anymore. Being assumed okay can feel lonelier than being completely alone. You notice it in small ways. Conversations don't pause for you. Questions don't wait for real answers. People move on before you've finished speaking. At first, you still try. You offer a little honesty, a longer response, a hint that something feels off. But you sense the shift, the discomfort, the unspoken impatience. So you adjust. You shorten your words. You soften what you really feel. You learn to say, "I'm fine," in a way that ends the conversation. And loneliness grows, not from the absence of people, but from standing right there and realizing no one is truly listening anymore. That realization stays with you long after the room empties. 3. The quiet shame. There's a kind of shame that often hides inside loneliness, a shame you rarely name, because you've lived a full life. You've survived hard things. You've carried responsibilities others never saw. So when loneliness shows up, you don't see it as pain. You see it as something you should be past by now. Loneliness feels embarrassing when you believe strength should have erased it. You tell yourself, "I shouldn't still feel this. I've handled worse. I'm lucky. I shouldn't complain." So you quiet your own ache. But pain doesn't disappear because you dismiss it. It just becomes quieter, heavier. And that quiet shame, the belief that you shouldn't need connection anymore, can weigh even more than the loneliness itself. 4. When memories outnumber plans. There was a time when the future felt full of plans, full of reasons to look ahead. Now, when you think about what's coming next, the space feels quieter. And when you look back, the memories arrive more easily than the plans. When memories begin to outweigh anticipation, loneliness settles in quietly. You remember conversations that once filled entire evenings. People who knew not just your stories, but your tone, your pauses, your moods before you spoke. And sometimes, what you miss isn't only them. You miss the version of yourself who was expected, relied on, needed without asking. That shift doesn't announce itself as grief. It shows up in the empty spaces, in afternoons with nowhere to go, in calendars that feel lighter than they used to. And that quiet loss is real. 5. Why you grew quieter. You didn't grow quieter because you had nothing to say. You grew quieter because you noticed what happened when you did speak. People listened halfway. They checked the time. They moved on too quickly. Silence is often learned. After your words stopped landing. So you adjusted. You shortened your stories. You softened your feelings. You learned how to sit with things instead of sharing them. Not because they weren't important, but because there was no space for them to rest. And the world rewarded you for it. You became easy, low maintenance, independent. But inside, something stayed unfinished. A thought without a place. A feeling without a listener. So the quiet grew, not as emptiness, but as a container holding everything you never stopped feeling. 6. Loneliness is not the enemy. Loneliness is often treated as something that needs to be fixed, as if it were a mistake, a weakness, something you should have outgrown. But loneliness is not your enemy. It didn't arrive to hurt you. It arrived to tell you something. Loneliness doesn't mean something is wrong. It means something inside you still matters. It means your heart still notices when something is missing, still longs for depth instead of distraction. That desire didn't fade with age. It became clearer. You no longer want noise. You want honesty, presence, moments that feel real. Loneliness appears when those things are absent. Not to punish you, but to point you back to what your heart has never stopped needing. 7. The connection you actually long for. You don't miss crowds. You miss being known, not through constant conversation, not through attention, but through quiet awareness. Someone who notices when your energy changes, when your voice softens, when you pause before answering. True connection is felt, long before it is explained. You don't want to be entertained. You don't want to perform. You want recognition, to be seen without having to ask, to be understood without having to justify your feelings. And when that kind of presence is missing, loneliness deepens, not because you are alone, but because no one is meeting you where you truly are. That longing isn't weakness, it's discernment. It comes from a life that has learned the difference between being surrounded and being understood. 8. What aging really reveals. Aging doesn't make you invisible. What it does is remove the noise that once filled your days. The rushing slows, the distractions fade, and what remains is what always mattered. Aging doesn't shrink the heart. It makes it more honest. You no longer chase approval. You stop pretending for comfort. You begin listening to what feels true. And when that truth isn't reflected back, when conversations stay shallow, when presence feels thin, loneliness appears, not as punishment, not as failure, but as clarity. It shows you that your heart has grown more selective. You're not asking for less from life. You're asking for what is real. And that quiet clarity, even when it feels lonely, is a sign of depth, not loss. 9. You are not too late. There may be a quiet part of you that wonders if the time for connection has passed, if the meaningful conversations belonged to another chapter, if now you're simply meant to manage alone. It is never too late to be understood, only harder when you believe it is. Depth doesn't expire. It doesn't belong to youth or to busy years. It belongs to honesty. You don't need many people in your life. You never did. What you need is one place where you don't have to explain yourself, where silence feels safe, where your presence is enough. Connection at this stage of life is not about starting over. It's about allowing yourself to be met as you are now. 10. Staying with the quiet. If this conversation felt like someone sitting beside you for a moment, let it be enough. You don't need answers tonight. You don't need to make sense of everything. Just stay here, with the quiet, with your breath, with the part of you that is still listening. Even quiet hearts deserve company. You are still here, still feeling, still open. And as long as this space exists, you don't have to carry the quiet alone.